Hello all the crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and it is finally time for me to talk about dynamic texture groups in GameMaker. By the way, if I sound a little bit funnier than usual today, I've had this really annoying cold all week. It's finally starting to go away and I can finally sort of talk normally again, but anyway, if I sound different, that's why. So, by default, all the graphics that are loaded into your GameMaker game added through the IDE, sprites, tile sets, fonts, and whatnot. By default, GameMaker will load those into your game's main memory as soon as the game starts, and it will just leave them there infinitely until the user closes the game. And realistically, for most GameMaker games, that's fine. GameMaker is an engine which is geared towards small productions and not things like, well, just imagine trying to have some of these loaded into memory at all times. Anyway, GameMaker has always had a few ways around this. For example, there is a function called sprite underscore add, which allows you to load a sprite from an external file. And there's a few functions like that. Sprite delete, which you can use to unload a sprite that was added in that way, which you could use. But there hasn't ever really been until fairly recently a way that you could load or unload an entire texture group that was built into the game through the asset browser in this way. So texture groups, of course, can be found under Tools, Texture Groups, and here you can create and change some of the settings on whichever texture groups you'd like. I've made videos on these in the past. I'm not going to get too into it now. If you don't know how texture groups work in general, go watch the ones that I will have linked down in the description. Anyway, I think until about a year ago, GameMaker didn't really have a way that you could manage when and how any of the texture groups in your game like this were loaded. So, again, for most GameMaker games, that's not really a problem. If I were to go and preview what the texture pages in this particular game look like, we would be able to see that every sprite in this game fits nice and neatly onto this fairly not very large texture page. And like this is going to be a couple of megabytes at most. If that's all loaded into your game all at once, it's not that big of a deal. But if you're making a large game that does have a lot of sprites and tile sets and character sprites and other miscellaneous textures, you might want to start thinking about whether or not you can find a way to only have the graphics and tiles and character sprites and whatever that you need in the immediate vicinity loaded into the game. This tends to be something that you run into more quickly when it comes to making games with high definition art than it is when you're making games with pixel art, but in this example, I will be using mostly pixel art just because that's those are the graphics that I have on hand to hack together a demo project. So speaking of this demo project, let's look at what we've got here. So this is familiar. This is the 2D sample project I've been using since about 2021 BC. And I've gone and added a little bit to it. And if I walk into this little teleporter here, we're going to transport to a different level, which has some different graphics in it. These are not ours. These are not what we're using in Ducks or anything like this. I pulled these off the internet. I'll have a link in the description of the video if you like what you see and you want to use them yourself. Anyway, I've also gone and sorted in the asset browser the main graphics, which are like the sprites and stuff that I use in that original level, the Wizarducks based sprites, and also an alternate set of graphics, which are the other ones. And yes, I know that they like clash stylistically in terrible ways, but I was in a hurry. Anyway, the important part here is that the main graphics, everything in the main graphics folder is only going to be needed when you are in room 1 here. And everything that is in the alternate graphics are only going to be needed when you are in room 2 here. There are a few sprites that are shared between these two rooms, like the player and the NPC sprites and whatever. And the 9 slice if you were to talk to an NPC and show dialogue or something like that. So armed with this knowledge, let's see how we can arrange our texture pages to allow us to load and unload sprites that we do or don't need at any given moment. So I'm going to create 2 new texture groups. I'm going to say tg underscore main, and I'm going to create a second texture group, and I'm going to call it tg underscore alternate. And the default one is going to be the one that the GameMaker always has all the time for basically uncategorized sprites and whatnot. tg underscore main and tg underscore alternate are going to be what I'm going to sort all these into. So I'm just going to select all these and I can't select sprites and tile sets in the same selection. So I'm going to select all these sprites that are used in the main in room 1. And in texture settings, I'm going to set them to the tg underscore main texture group. We can do the same thing for this that tile set. And for the alternate graphics, let's go and sort those into tg underscore alternate. And I'm also going to put the tile set in there. So this is going to change where these are stored under the hood inside the game. It's not going to make any visible differences when we actually run the game. All the graphics are still going to be here, and they're all going to be ultimately drawn eventually. If I were to go and preview those texture pages again, we would see that now instead of having everything on a single image, on a single atlas, we're going to have this one. So this is going to be the default group, which is going to be everything that wasn't categorized somewhere else. We're going to have this, which is going to be the alternate group. These are the sprites that I downloaded from the internet. And tg underscore main, this is everything that was in the starting room. There are other reasons you might want to organize your sprites onto their own texture pages like this, which is not related to what we're doing today, but I'm not going to be getting into that right now. Anyway, so to load these texture groups dynamically, I'm going to want to make a small change in the texture group settings, which is going to be to change the group type from default to dynamic. And I'm going to do that to both the main and the alternate texture group pages. So the effect that this is going to have on the game is that these texture groups are now dynamic, and they won't actually be loaded from the disk into your game's main memory until they're actually needed. And so unfortunately, this does mean that you're going to have to do a little bit more work in the rest of your game to make sure that like nothing funny happens. So if I run the game now, you're going to see something for the tiniest fraction of a second the first time, basically the first frame that the game drew. And if you didn't see it, you can go back in the video and you can scrub through with the period and comma keys on the YouTube player so that you can see frame by frame exactly what happened. Basically what happened is that GameMaker has a default texture, which is this checker pattern like this, which is used for everything when the texture page that a graphic lives on has not yet been loaded. And GameMaker will load it if it is needed, if it is called upon. And in this case, because it's not very big and because I have a fast SSD, it only took maybe a frame or two to load in. If you're working with larger textures or if you have a slower hard drive, it might take a little bit longer because this process is asynchronous. And GameMaker will, until the texture is loaded properly, it will use that test pattern. If I go into the other room, you'll see it again. This one might last a little bit longer because the graphics are a little bit bigger, but you might have noticed a little bit more of an obvious checker pattern there. The reason that it's cut up in funny ways is because that checker pattern will represent the entire texture page, and individual sprites are only a small portion of the texture page. So if you don't want that to happen, and you probably don't because it does look pretty weird, you're going to have to do a little bit of work to preload each texture group when you actually need it. So like I said, GameMaker will automatically load a texture group when a sprite or a font or something else that lives on it is called by the game. But there are also a pair of functions which you can use to manually control this. So you have texture group load and texture group unload. And these functions do pretty much what you think they're going to do. So texture group load is a function which will load a texture group before you actually need to draw anything on it. So I can give it a group name such as tg underscore main, an optional argument which I believe defaults to false for prefetching the textures into VRAM in addition to main memory. You can set this to true or false if you like. It doesn't really matter that much. There's probably not really a downside to automatically prefetching your textures when you load it like this. Prefetching basically just means loading your sprite into VRAM before it's actually needed. This is obviously a lot faster to do than loading it from the disk into main memory, but texture group unload, this obviously does the opposite. This will delete a texture group from memory. You would use this, for example, after you leave a room where a texture group is needed and you don't have a need for the graphics that belong there, and you can unload them until it's time to go back. Anyway, how I would probably recommend doing this is going to be to do something like in the room start event. So GameMaker has a room start event where where you can do things like initialization for the given room that you're in. And I can just real fast say if room equals room 1 texture group load. The group name is going to be, it's tg underscore main, right? All right, main and alternate. So we can say tg underscore main, else if room equals room 2, we can texture group load tg underscore alternate. And when you leave a room, there's also a room end event. And this is where you might want to switch things around. So we can texture group unload the texture group that we're not using at any given moment, and we can only have the one that we actually need. So if I run the game now, we're going to see that see, it looked like we skipped the loading. That time it didn't. So I actually wasn't sure if we were still going to see the checker pattern in either of those rooms, because it's possible that the amount of time that it takes to load a texture group from the disk is less than the time it takes to actually like go to the new room, but it's also possible that it isn't. It depends on how like much stuff there is in the room to initialize, and how big the texture pages are, how long it takes them to come in from the disk and that kind of thing.
Hey.
So what you probably want to do if you're going to do something like this is to actually use a loading screen of some sort to fade to black. I don't know if I really want to make a video on making, like, actually doing a loading screen, because there's a million ways to do a loading screen, and there's not really any way that's like inherently better than any other way of doing a loading screen. But I think what I will do is very quick and dirty. In something like the draw GUI event of the player here, or of some other game control that you might or might not have, what would be the least weird way of doing this? So let me first get the status of a texture group. So we can use the function texture group get. No, it's, yes, texture group get status. tg underscore main. And this is a function which will return a different status code depending on what exactly your texture group is doing. So if it hasn't been loaded, if it's in the process of loading, that kind of thing. Let me say this is going to be tg underscore status. I think would be a good name for that variable. And we can say if tg underscore status equals texture group status unloaded, or tg status equals texture group status loading. So if your texture group has not been loaded yet, or if it is in the process of loading into the game, then you might just do something like, I don't know, draw clear c underscore black. Clear the screen and like draw text. Draw text that says loading or something like that. You could be fancy, you could have a progress bar or something like that if you've got a bunch of stuff that you want to load. Anyway, this will mask the textures that are not yet in the game by just basically drawing a black screen that says loading. Let's see, texture group get status tg underscore main. I probably want that to be like based on the texture group that actually belongs to this room, right? So just to be clear, in an actual game, you would probably never do like an if else based on what room you're in to decide what texture group you want to load like this. You would probably have some kind of like some kind of index that tells GameMaker what texture group, or texture groups plural in some cases, are needed by each individual map or whatever. Anyway, guess I could be a little bit irresponsible about this and just tg status equals that, or tg status equals the alternate one like this. And Feather is not going to like that because of scoping rules. This is not like quote unquote good code, but anyway, let me run this now. It's going to work. You know what? Wait a minute. I just saw this needs to be texture group status loading, not loaded. I hate verbs. Anyway, so I did not see a screen with that had loading text on it in the main room. So it looks like that texture group actually did load fast enough that it came in before the first frame was drawn. If I go to the other one now, so instead of that weird like checker pattern, and the loading screen was also only on screen for like a couple of frames, right? And I couldn't actually read the text, but I did see that it was black and it had white on it. And just like that, we have ourselves a very primitive loading screen instead of looking at like that awkward texture pop in, which definitely looked a little bit weird. Obviously, if you're gonna have a loading screen, you probably want to have it like fade in and out nicely or something like that, or have some other kind of transition that doesn't look extremely like 5 lines of Cody like this is. You probably also want to have a nicer way of figuring out which texture groups belong in which room than like better than what I'm doing here. There's also, you could go further with this, of course, if you're making something like some kind of open world game and you want to have some kind of like dynamic loading and unloading when the player walks far away off screen from some type of like biome or something like that. I really want to make more videos on GM Room Loader and do something like that. I feel like that would be a lot of fun, but I'm actually going to have to sit down and plan that out. Anyway, that is the basics of texture group loading and unloading in GameMaker. There is one more thing that was added a little bit more recently than this, which is texture group add, which allows you to do very similar things to dynamically loading and unloading texture groups like this, but it allows you to basically load graphics from arbitrary files instead of through texture groups that you already defined in GameMaker. And I'm going to talk about that soon too, but there is a little bit more to that, and I think it does deserve its own video, so that'll probably be the next thing I do. But that is enough for right now. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the description of this video. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to that can be found down below also. I do like to post videos on weird stuff you can do in GameMaker, so if anything like this appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. I hope you all found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Zach Robinson, Squarecrow, Spy Games, Pixelated Pope, Paradox. I have seen you around before, but I realized like a minute ago that your name is a pun on Paradox. Good job. Manta Ray, GameMaker, Game Art Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, Brenton, Bokeh Dev, and Argo the Knot for supporting these videos. If you want to join these wonderful people and support the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.